In this video, we're going to learn the entire history of the British Empire in under 7 minutes. Let's do it! The British Empire is often called the largest empire in history. However, if you look at the population of the Russian Empire at its peak in the early 20th century, it had over 180 million people compared to Britain's 43 million. So the Russian Empire was almost 4 times larger than the British one. But the British Empire did last longer. The first seeds of it were planted in 1583, when Queen Elizabeth I granted a royal charter to the British East India Company, which would rule over parts of India for the next 200 years. At the same time, other European countries were establishing their own colonial empires all around the world. But England would soon become the world powered by the late 17th century, thanks to 3 factors. Firstly, the Industrial Revolution started in Britain and made it wealthier and stronger than other nations. Secondly, the English Navy was growing rapidly. In 1652, the Anglo-Dutch War started. This war was caused by Dutch attempts to challenge English control of the seas. After the English Civil War and the Dutch seizure of English merchant ships, after 7 years of fighting, England defeated the Dutch decisively at the Battle of Solebay and gained naval supremacy, allowing them to dominate trade routes. And finally, the transatlantic slave trade fueled the economy of Bristol, Liverpool, and London, making them richer while crippling Africa. By the late 19th century, the British Empire stretched from the USA to New Zealand and included about half of all the land and 1/4 of all the people on Earth. It became so vast that it even included places like Hong Kong, Singapore, Tasmania, and Sri Lanka, which are all separated by huge distances. But how exactly did they manage to get all of these places under their control? Well, in North America, most of the 13 colonies were established during the reign of King George II between 1727 and 17. But after the 7 Years' War, the British government decided to tax the colonists more heavily, which caused the American Revolutionary War. After defeating the Redcoats, the United States of America was born. But the British didn't give up on North America. They simply moved further west. They fought against the Native Americans and took huge amounts of land from them before eventually forcing them onto small reservations. Many of these lands were then sold to European immigrants who farmed the land and ranched cattle. Meanwhile, slavery was still legal in most of the southern states. And since the British government didn't care much about human rights, the rich landowners kept exploiting the slaves until it was eventually abolished in 1833. But then something really weird happened. After they abolished slavery in their own empire, they started supporting the Confederacy in the American Civil War. The British didn't want to lose access to the cotton that the southern states produced, which was essential for the textile industry back home. They even came very close to entering the war themselves. But they didn't because it would have been a political suicide. Lincoln was obviously which made him very popular with the northern states, while the King of Britain was seen as a supporter of the Confederacy, which would make him very unpopular back home. In the end, the Union won, and slavery was abolished throughout the entire country. But this wasn't the end of the story. Soon, Britain would start taking huge amounts of land in Africa. They took control of South Africa from the Dutch and then started exploring and taking over other parts of the continent. At the same time, the British monarch was also ruling over Ireland, but the Irish people weren't happy about this arrangement. Over the course of the 19th century, the potato blight killed over 1 million Irish people and caused mass starvation. While some people did receive food aid from Britain, most of it was exported to other parts of the empire instead. This led to many Irish people hating the British monarchy and wanting independence instead. But when World War I broke out, many of them volunteered to fight for the empire anyway, hoping that they would get rewarded with independence afterwards. But this wasn't the case at all. Instead, the war caused even more hardship and death in Ireland. So a new movement called Sinn Féin started to fight for an independent Irish republic. The British responded by sending in the military, and things only ended when the Irish decided to accept a partition of their country. Northern Ireland would remain part of the UK, while the rest would become the Irish Free State as the 20th century began. The British Empire was at the height of its power, but it wouldn't last for much longer. During the First World War, they managed to maintain control over their empire despite the distances. This was mainly thanks to their navy, which was the largest in the world. Unfortunately, this didn't last long because the war was devastating the economy. Germany had sunk over 600 of their merchant ships, and this was causing severe food shortages back home. So Britain had to enter the war on the side of the Triple Entente just to protect their shipping lane. The British Empire did have control over huge parts of the world, but that didn't mean that they could easily move troops and supplies around the world. For example, there were no direct routes between Britain and Australia, so the journey took months and countless lives. But luckily, the invention of the telegraph in the 1830s meant that the British commanders could communicate with their armies across the globe in mere hours. This was vital in maintaining control over such a vast empire. Also, the British divided their empire into different regions and gave each of them to a different department. For example, there was the India Office, the Colonial Office, and the War Office. These departments were supposed to keep track of everything going on in the empire, but it rarely worked like that in practice. Most of the time, the administrators back in Britain knew very little about what was going on in their colonies. Despite having telegraph lines connecting all of their major cities, the fact was that running an empire across two continents was extremely difficult. That's why the British government preferred to delegate much of the administration to local leaders. That way, they could avoid sending too many people overseas and wasting money. But this practice had its own downsides because it meant that the British government couldn't know whether or not those leaders were actually doing a good job. During World War II, Britain once again managed to keep control over their far-flung empire. But the war was even more devastating for them. They lost almost every single one of their merchant ships, forcing them to rely on convoys to ship supplies back to Britain. But after the war, decolonization started to take place. One of the first countries to gain independence was India. It had been ruled by the British East India Company and then the Crown for over 200 years. But the Indian people weren't happy about being ruled over by the British monarchy, especially after they had been promised independence in exchange for their support during the war. So they started protesting and boycotting British goods, which caused the British government to lose a lot of money. Eventually, they had to accept the independence of India in 1947. At the same time, Pakistan was also created in the region of Bengal, which led to one of the largest migrations in modern history, with over 10 million people moving between the two countries. But India wasn't the only colony that was looking for independence. By the end of the 1970s, every single colony of Britain had gained full independence. Today, the Commonwealth of Nations is a group of 56 countries that were formerly part of the British Empire. Together, they represent over 2.2 billion people around the world. What's interesting is that every single country that speaks English as an official language today was once part of the British Empire. This includes the United States, Canada, South Africa, and Australia, among many others. Now, if you enjoyed this video, please make sure to subscribe. If you want to learn more about the British Empire, I would recommend you to watch our previous video about the British East India Company, and I'll see you next time.